Welcome to the lecture for Basics of Biblical Hebrew, Chapter 13, the cal-perfect strong verb. In this lecture, we will cover the meaning of the cal stem, the basic function of the perfect or suffix conjugation, the cal-perfect strong verb paradigm, very important. We'll look at stative verbs, and then the negative particle lo, meaning no or not, for negating a verb. Let's begin with an introduction to the cal stem. The cal stem constitutes 69% of the Hebrew verbal system. That is, approximately 50,000 of the 72,000 verbs in Hebrew are cal stem verbs. And we're going to be looking at these verbs in chapters 13 through 22. So we're going to be giving plenty of time and attention to these verbs. Cal stem verbs are active in voice, which means the subject will generally perform the action with a simple action or unnuanced type of action, meaning it won't be intensive or causative, and we'll get into those stems after chapter 22. The simple action of the cal stem, you should know, is further divided into transitive, intransitive, and stative. And if you're like me, before you studied Hebrew, you did not know what transitive, intransitive, or stative meant, and so let me help you understand. Transitive verbs may take a direct object. Look at the example, the prophet wrote the book. In this example, the verb wrote takes a definite object, the book. What did the prophet write? The book. Transitive verbs can take a direct object. Intransitive verbs, however, cannot take a direct object. In the example, the king perished in battle, the verb perished does not take or cannot take a direct object. We just simply know that the king perished in battle somewhere. Finally, stative verbs. Stative verbs cannot take a direct object either, and they're used to describe a state of being, something like the priest is old. In English, we use a form of the verb to be and an adjective to describe a state of being, but Hebrew has its own class of verbs to do this very same thing. So we have transitive verbs that can take a direct object, but they don't always need to. We have intransitive verbs that can't take a direct object, and then we'll have stative verbs that describe a state of being in Hebrew. We'll work on each of these in turn. Let's consider a few important facts about the perfect conjugation in Hebrew together. First, the perfect conjugation is sometimes called the suffix conjugation. That's because in most of its forms, a suffix is added in order to indicate the person, gender, and number of the verb. We also know that the perfect or suffix conjugation is used to describe a completed action, and that's called verbal aspect. Verbal aspect in the perfect signifies an action with its conclusion envisioned in the mind of the speaker or writer. Or to state it differently, aspect in the perfect denotes a completed action, whether in the past, present, or future. With English, we think about verbs having tense, and tense being related to time, the past, the present, or the future. So we have a past tense verb in English, he kicked, a present tense verb in English, he kicks, and a future tense verb in English, he will kick. Now, Hebrew is capable of indicating time, but it doesn't do so primarily with these conjugations, the perfect or the imperfect. Rather, the perfect and the imperfect, and here the perfect or suffix conjugation, is primarily encoding what's called aspect or type of action. And the aspect of the perfect is a completed action, whether in the past, the present, or future. And we'll see how that works a little bit later. Finally, the perfect may be translated by the English past tense, as in he studied, present perfect, he has studied, past perfect, he had studied, or future perfect, he will have studied. When used to describe a state of being, it will often be translated with the English present tense. So you can see that the perfect conjugation has a wide range of translation possibilities in English because the perfect aspect denotes a completed action, either in the past, the present, or the future. This may seem a little bit overwhelming or confusing at first, but it will begin to make sense as we see how the perfect conjugation is used in context. We now come to the all-important cal-perfect strong verb paradigm. In this chapter, this is the most important part of the information presented, the cal-perfect strong verb paradigm. You must memorize this paradigm, as we say, like a robot, with absolute precision, with machine-like data recovery in every instance. Let's begin by working through this paradigm together and pronouncing each of the forms in turn. Katal, katala, katalta, katalt, katalti, katalu, kataltem, katalten, katalnu. You'll observe that this paradigm is arranged first with the third person, moving down to the first person singular, and then plural. You'll see in the sufformative column that we've listed each of the different sufformatives or suffixes added to the verb that are used to indicate person, gender, and number. Those sufformatives appear in red in this column labeled perfect. Finally, we give a translation, which is a basic translation, a simple past tense. We're going to begin our study of the perfect conjugation by using a simple past tense for the verbs in this chapter. So katal means he killed, but katala means she killed. And the reason I know that the person and gender and number of the verb has shifted is by the sufformatives that appear in red. Now, what do I mean by sufformative? You know that there are suffixes or pronominal suffixes or things that appear at the end of words, and we call those in general suffixes. And these sufformatives are also verbal suffixes. But when a suffix is used to indicate the person, the gender, and number of a verb, we give it this special name, sufformative. They appear only on verbs, and they are used to indicate person, gender, or number. So it's, in some sense, a special subclass of suffix, the sufformative, and that may be a new word for you. You don't have to memorize the sufformatives individually as they appear in black in that column. You do, however, have to memorize each form of the perfect conjugation in this order as it appears on this page, those forms that are highlighted now in yellow for you. Let's say them again, and I'm going to comment on a couple of features that must be specifically or carefully memorized. We'll begin again with katal and work down. Katal, katala, katalta, katalt, katalti, katalu, kataltem, katalten, katalnu. When you're memorizing these forms, you'll need to remember that two forms are spelled with the metheg, the 3FS, and the 3CP. You must memorize the metheg as a part of the spelling for this word. You'll also see that three forms have an accent mark over the second syllable, the 2MS, the 1CS, and the 1CP. You must memorize those forms with that accent mark. Every consonant, vowel, metheg, and accent mark must be memorized with robotic precision, and here's why. The way in which we handle verbs and paradigms in Basics of Biblical Hebrew is this. We're going to try and give you the fewest possible paradigms to memorize. But those paradigms that we do give you to memorize, we want you to memorize like a robot. Then, when we move on to weak verbs or the derived stems that will come later, you won't have to memorize paradigms. You'll memorize certain diagnostic features or spelling changes that you already know. So if you memorize a few paradigms well, you won't have to memorize many paradigms. When I took Hebrew many, many years ago, we spent the entire first semester memorizing verbal paradigms. I couldn't reproduce those now if I had to. I do know, however, this one particular paradigm and all the variations of it because of the features I know from the strong verb paradigm. So, let me emphasize this again. Memorize this paradigm like a robot. You should write it out hundreds of times over the course of your study of Hebrew. It needs to be in your memory in terms of every bit of information. Consonants, vowels, accent marks, and methegs. The reason for this is not to be unduly burdensome, but it's actually to save you work later. We'll now turn and look at a few CalPerfect strong verbs, not for memorization, but just to show you why we memorize the paradigm. You'll see that in the examples that are listed from Yeshav, Zakar, Kathav, Shamar, or Kavatz, that each of these verbs are inflected just like the Cal strong verb paradigm you have studied. Every vowel, accent mark, and metheg is the exact same in each of the forms as you work across the paradigm in each category. So the reason that you memorize the paradigm is so that you can identify those features that make it what it is in terms of person, gender, and number in all the other verbs that you'll see. The only thing that changes in each of the forms that you see on this page are the consonants that appear to mark the semantic information. There are a couple of minor spelling changes or variations that you need to be aware of when it comes to the perfect verb. The first has to do with verbal roots ending in tau. Here's what happens. When a verbal root ending in tau receives a sufformative beginning with tau, the two identical consonants become one consonant with a dogish forte. You already know that Hebrew doesn't like to write two consonants that are identical next to each other because they have the system of the dogish forte, which doubles the letter that it appears in. So if you look at this first example, we have karath ta. You can see marked in red is the final root letter tau and the 2ms sufformative ta. Because the verbal root ends in tau and the sufformative begins with tau, Hebrew will simply write that tau once with a dogish forte, karat ta. This can be a little confusing at first because you see the sufformative and you recognize it as 2ms, but now you need to reconstruct the verbal root, and you need to identify that dogish in the begad kafat as a dogish forte because it's immediately preceded by a vowel, and then you can look up the word under kaf, resh, tau. The assimilation of the tau with a dogish forte will appear in the 2ms, the 2fs, the 1cs, the 2mp, and the 2fp, because each of those verbs have sufformatives that begin with a tau. This doesn't happen very often in biblical Hebrew, but it's good to be aware of it now so that when you encounter it, you won't be caught off guard. Let's look at verbal roots ending in noon. You already know that the noon likes to assimilate when it can, and it will here as well. When a verbal root ending in noon receives a sufformative beginning with noon or tau, the two consonants may become one consonant with a dogish forte. Let's look at our examples below, and you'll see in our first example, shekanu. The verbal root has noon in the third root position, and the sufformative begins with noon. The result, therefore, is a single noon with a dogish forte. There are still two noons, but it's written once with the dogish forte, becoming shekanu. In that case, both forms are pronounced exactly the same, and you'll need to reconstruct that root noon when you see it in order to look it up in the lexicon. Our second example is from the verbal root nathan, meaning to give, and here we have the 1cs, nathanti. Here you can see that the verbal root ends in noon, and the sufformative begins with tau. The noon likes to assimilate when it can, and it will assimilate into a tau, and so the resulting form is one tau with a dogish forte. Like you experienced with the preposition min, the noon has assimilated into the following consonant as a dogish forte. This one's a little trickier because you don't have two taus, you have a noon that's assimilated as a tau. So you'll have to properly reconstruct that verbal root. Now, the verb nathan, to give, appears frequently in the Hebrew Bible, and you'll be able to do this soon because you'll encounter it so often. So remember, verbal roots ending in tau or noon may assimilate the final root letter into the sufformative in those environments that they permit. Now that we've covered the basic meaning and form of the paradigm verb katal for the Cal Perfect Strong verb, let's discuss the stative verbs. The first thing you need to know that there are three classes of stative verbs. Stative verbs are classified by their stem vowel. Now, what's the stem vowel? The stem vowel is associated with the second root consonant. That is, the stem vowel will be the vowel that appears under the second root consonant before the third root letter. With strong verbs that are transitive, the stem vowel is pathic, as in shamar, katal, and zakar. You can see in each of those examples, the stem vowel appears under the second root letter, and it's highlighted in red. With stative verbs, however, the stem vowel is variable. The three classes of the stative verb are pathic stative, seri stative, and holum stative. And this classification system is due to the fact that the pathic statives have pathic stem vowels, that the seri statives have seri stem vowels, and that the holum statives have holum stem vowels. In your vocabulary, you'll be able to identify those verbs that are pathic, seri, or holum stative by their stem vowel. Because stative verbs describe a state of being, they're usually translated with a form of the verb to be followed by an adjective. In English, that's how we describe stative realities, a form of the verb to be with an adjective. Hebrew has these stative verbs. One of the ways you'll identify stative verbs in your vocabulary is that they have this to be plus an adjective definition, like we have in these examples: to be or become great, to be wise, to be heavy, to be old, to be small, or finally, to be able. Let's look at the stative verbs in the Cal Perfect. Now again, we're going to be looking at these stem vowels, so we'll begin with the pathic stative, then move to the serif stative, and then the holum stative, all the while keeping in mind our strong verb on the right for comparison. Now when it comes to stative verbs that are the pathic stative verbs, you'll see the pathic stem vowel, and the pathic stative is inflected just like the Cal Perfect strong verb. So there's no change in spelling between the strong verb and the pathic stative. You'll have to know that these are pathic stative verbs by their definitions in the lexicon or the vocabulary section of the grammar. With the serif stative, there's only one spelling change in the whole paradigm. In the 3ms form, the stem vowel is sere. In all other forms of the paradigm, the strong verb spelling of the regular verb is maintained. So only the 3ms will there be a slight distinction. Again, you'll know these are stative verbs by their definitions in the lexicon or in the vocabulary section of the grammar. With holum stative verbs, we're going to see a spelling change in most of the forms, and that is the presence of an O-class stem vowel. So instead of an A or an E-class stem vowel, in the holum stative, we're going to see an O-class stem vowel, as in katon. In the 3fs, the stem vowel has reduced, and so there's no change in spelling there. Then in the 2ms, katonta, katont, katonti. Nothing in the 3cp because the stem vowel has reduced. Then the second masculine plural form, we're going to see a kamat-satuf, katontem. The same in the second feminine plural, katontem. And then in the 1cp, katonu. You'll observe that in most of the forms, all but two, you'll see that O-class stem vowel, either holum or kamat-satuf, and that will identify those as holum stative verbs. What you need to focus on, however, is that in all of these verbs, the perfect suffirmatives that mark or identify person, gender, and number are unchanged. And the verbal roots are unchanged. So if you work hard on memorizing your Cal strong verb paradigm, you'll see and be able to identify the person, gender, and number of each verb without any trouble. You also need to know that stative verbs are very closely related in form to their corresponding adjectives. Look at your screen with me. Stative verbs are closely related to their corresponding adjectives, as we have just said. The difference between a stative verb and its corresponding adjective is that one is inflected as a verb and the other as an adjective. Now that sounds a little bit funny, but of course that's true. A stative Cal Perfect verb will take perfect suffirmatives and inflect for person, gender, and number. The corresponding adjective will take the inflectional endings a, im, or oath, just like any other adjective. So you'll see in the examples below, the stative verb Cal Perfect 3ms is identical in form to the adjective that is masculine singular. The verb kaved, to be heavy, and the adjective kaved, simply heavy. The stative verb male, to be full, and then the adjective full. You'll see both an identity in form and a close relationship in meaning. The stative verb tame, to be unclean, and the adjective tame, unclean. The stative verb ra'ev, to be hungry, and the adjective hungry. The stative verbs will be inflected with perfect suffirmatives. The adjectives will be inflected with adjectival endings, the a, im, or oath of the adjectival inflection. And that's how you'll tell the difference. The only time you'll really experience any major difficulty in identifying or distinguishing the forms is with the Cal Perfect 3ms and then the masculine singular form. And in those cases, context will have to help you decide between the verb and the adjective. And in most cases, it's easy enough to do. Parsing. The parsing of perfect verbs involves the identification of the verbal stem, conjugation, person, gender, number, and lexical form or verbal root. When parsing, always give the information in the proper order, as the following examples demonstrate. Here you have the verb zakarti. It's Cal Perfect 1CS. We begin with the stem, we follow it with the conjugation, and then the person, gender, and number with the lexical form or the verbal root. The translation is not required, but we put it here just for reference. With our second example, shamart, we have the Cal Perfect 2FS from shamar, or simply shin, mim, resh. You observed. Again, we begin with the stem, we follow it with the conjugation, and then the person, gender, or number with lexical form or verbal root. Always use that system. Finally, we come to the negative particle lo. Perfect and imperfect verbs may be negated with the particle lo, meaning no or not. The particle lo may also be spelled with the holem wow, lamed, holem wow, aleph. The negative particle is always placed immediately before the verb it negates. So in the example that we have below, lo, shamartim, eth, hatoroth. Translated, you did not observe the laws. The verb shamartim, Cal Perfect 2MP, is negated by the negative particle lo. Without the negative particle, we would translate this something like you observed the laws, but with the negative particle, you did not observe the laws. This is the Hebrew word for no, or one of the Hebrew words for no. Look at the second example. Lo, zakarta, eth, habrith. You did not remember the covenant. The negative particle lo is immediately before the verb, the Cal Perfect 2MP of zakar, and it negates the verbal action. Without the lo, we would translate this, you remembered the covenant. With the lo, we translate it, you did not remember the covenant. The particle lo negates the perfect verb in each instance. So before you move on from this chapter, here's what you need to do and what you need to know. First, memorize the Cal Perfect strong verb paradigm with absolute precision. Master every consonant, vowel, accent mark, and method. Pay special attention to the suffirmatives that appear in all the forms but the 3MS. These suffirmatives are unique and will identify the person, gender, and number of each verb. Second, understand the basic translation for the perfect or suffix conjugation. We'll begin by a simple past tense verb in English, but understand that with stative verbs, it's going to be a form of the verb to be and an adjective. And sometimes we'll have different values like present or future perfect. Next, understand what is required in parsing verbs and memorize the order in which the information is to be presented. You will get plenty of practice in each of the homework chapters from here on out in the grammar, so I'm not too worried about this, but make sure you're consistent in each instance. Finally, be able to identify and explain the difference between transitive, intransitive, and stative verbs in Hebrew. It's important to know because these types of verbs are translated in slightly different ways and will do different things in their context. Transitive verbs will take direct objects, intransitive verbs can't take direct objects, and stative verbs describe states of being. This concludes our lecture for the Cal Perfect strong verb. Welcome to the lecture for Basics of Biblical Hebrew, Chapter 14, Cal Perfect weak verbs. In this lecture, we will cover the various spelling features of weak verbs in the Cal Perfect. Now, in this chapter, paradigm memorization is not required. Let me emphasize that again, paradigm memorization is not required. Rather, it'll be important to understand the variations and patterns of spellings encountered with weak verbs. The principles learned in this chapter will apply throughout the remaining chapters. So in chapter 13, we learned the Cal Perfect strong verb. Before you get into this chapter, you must make certain that you have memorized the Cal Perfect paradigm for the strong verb like a robot. Only then will you be able to identify and understand the various weak verb spelling changes that we will see here. Let's begin with one guttural, two guttural, and third chet ayin weak verbs. In these weak verb classes, we're going to see the expected vocal schwa replaced by hatif pathic. Now you understand that one of the three characteristics of a guttural consonant is that it will not appear with a vocal schwa, but it will take the hatef vowels, usually hatef pathic. So in the CalPerfect strong verb paradigm, where you have a guttural and an expected vocal schwa, that vocal schwa will change to a Hatef Pathic. This is a minor change and shouldn't give you any difficulty because you've already seen this type of change in many other instances and environments. Let's begin with our one guttural category, and we'll observe that there are only two spots where the vocal schwa is replaced by a Hatef Pathic, in the 2MP and the 2FP. You'll observe in the right-hand column in the strong verb that there's a vocal schwa under the kof. Because in the weak verb, the one guttural weak verb, the first root letter is an ayin or a guttural, you can't have the vocal schwa, and you'll take the Hatef Pathic vowel. In the two guttural category, there are also two places where the vocal schwa changes to Hatef Pathic, in the 3MS and in the 3CP. But again, this change is relatively minor and shouldn't give you any trouble. All of the root letters are still present, and none of the perfect affirmatives have been altered in any way. In the third chet ayin category, there's only one change, and this change is not like the others. It's in the 2FS, shama'at. Here we have the normal silent schwa under the guttural and third root position changed to a pathic, and that's to preserve the pronunciation of the guttural in that position. But again, all of the other spelling features are present, and the perfect affirmative has not changed in any way, so you shouldn't have any trouble identifying these weak verbs. If you know the principle that the guttural cannot take a vocal schwa but will take a Hatef Pathic, and you can identify and explain those features in the conjugation, you'll have no trouble parsing those verbs and rendering them properly into translation. Let's look together at third Aleph verbs. Third Aleph verbs have a Kametz stem vowel, a quiescent Aleph, and the loss of the Dagesh Lene in perfect affirmatives. Let's look together at these forms. You'll see highlighted in red in each of these forms, but here in the 3MS, that the stem vowel has changed from Pathic to Kametz in each of the forms that maintains the stem vowel. It's reduced in the 3FS and the 3CP, so those forms are identical to the strong verb. Now, the reason that the stem vowel has changed from Pathic to Kametz is that the Aleph is quiescent or silent in each form. And when an Aleph becomes quiescent, it causes compensatory lengthening. Pathic lengthens to Kametz. And you've seen compensatory lengthening before, and you've even seen the compensatory lengthening of Pathic to Kametz. So when an Aleph becomes quiescent, the vowel before it's going to lengthen. And that's what we see here in the 2MS, for example, mathatha or mathath. You'll also observe that because the Aleph has quiesced, the suffirmatives are now preceded by a vowel sound, and so the Dagesh Lene that you would normally see in the perfect affirmative has dropped out. So it's no longer the hard T, but the soft T, as in the 1CS mathathi. The hard T is gone, and the Dagesh Lene has dropped out because of the quiescent Aleph, and is now preceded by the vowel sound. Those changes, however, still should not cause you any trouble. All of the root letters are present, and the spelling of all the perfect affirmatives, except for the Dagesh Lene, are the same. And you should be accustomed to seeing the Dagesh Lene fall out or be added because of the absence or presence of the vowel or consonant before it. We now move to third Hey verbs. This is a very common weak verb class, and it does give students a bit of trouble on occasion. Here's what happens. In third Hey verbs, we have the loss of the third root consonant in all forms except apparently the 3MS. We have the Hey changes to Tau in the 3FS before the suffirmative, and you know why. You can't add a suffix or a suffirmative to a word that ends in Hey, so the Hey will have to drop out or strengthen, and in this case it strengthens to Tau. And finally, there's a Hirik Yod stem vowel in all first and second person forms. So let's look at these together. In our 3MS or lexical form, bana, we see the Kametz Hey at the end, and that reminds us that this verb is third Hey. In every other form, there is no Hey present in the spelling of the paradigm. In the 3FS form, the Hey has strengthened to Tau before the perfect affirmative Kametz Hey. So you'll have to reconstruct this verbal root by knowing it's from Beit Nun Hey and not Beit Nun Tau in order to look it up in the lexicon. In the 2MS form, Bani Tha, the Hey has fallen out, and now there is a Hirik Yod stem vowel associated with the second root letter, Nun. The perfect supportive is unchanged except for the fact that the Dagesh lene dropped out. And the same feature applies to the 2FS beneath, the 1CS beneatha, the 2MP beneathem, the 2FP beneathen, and the 1CP beninu. In each of those forms, the he is dropped out and is replaced by a hierik yod. And here's a little secret about third he verbs. Third he verbs used to be third yod. That is, instead of bana, it was banai. And over time, all of those third yod verbs converted to third he. When the third he verb is inflected in the perfect, however, that original yod root letter comes back as hierik yod. And if you know that third he verbs used to be third yod, you can use this hierik yod to reconstruct the verbal root. You can use your Hebrew CSI skills and know that that hierik yod is diagnostic of the third he weak verb class. Finally, in the 3CP, we'll notice that the he has dropped out and there is no hierik yod. And in this particular instance, you'll have to know that third he verbs is one of the options for reconstructing this verbal root. And it's always a good idea to begin with third he verbs when you're reconstructing verbal roots because they are so common. That's the third he verb. Let's look at geminate verbs. Geminate verbs have a number of features that are unique to them. First, with the geminate verbs, there is the assimilated geminate consonant in all first and second person forms. There is a holum while connecting vowel in those same forms, and then the loss of the Dagesh lene in perfect supportives, because now those perfect supportives are appearing after a vowel. Now as we look, we can see two types of geminate verbs, the type 1 and the type 2. The vast majority of geminate verbs in Hebrew are type 1, so we'll focus our attention there. In the third person, savav, savava, and savavu, the strong verb spelling is maintained in each instant, and both geminate consonants appear in the spelling of the verb. In all second and first person verbs, the geminate consonant is written only once with the Dagesh forte, and you can see that, for example, in the 2MS, sabotha. Additionally, between the geminate consonant with Dagesh forte and the perfect supportive, there has been added a holum while connecting vowel. This vowel precedes the perfect supportive, and therefore the Dagesh lene has dropped out of those forms of the perfect supportive that take it, those with the tau. So this form looks quite unusual because of the Dagesh forte and the geminate consonant, the holum while connecting vowel, and the loss of the Dagesh lene. But if you've memorized your Cal Perfect strong verb paradigm like a robot, and you know that geminate consonants like Dagesh fortes, and that you can associate that holum while connecting vowel with the geminate weak verb class, you're going to be able to parse and reconstruct these verbs every time. Again, don't memorize the paradigm itself, but memorize those important features about the geminate paradigm that will help you to identify and reconstruct the verbal root. Namely, in the second and first person forms, the geminate consonant with Dagesh forte, and the holum while connecting vowel. In addition to weak verbs that have only one weak root letter, there are also doubly weak verbs. These verbs have more than one weak root consonant. In such cases, the weak verb spelling features for both weak consonants will appear. Our first doubly weak verb is both third he and two guttural, and it's the verb ra'ah. It will maintain all of the weak verb spelling features of third he verbs, that is a hierik yod stem vowel, or the addition of the tau in the 3FS, but it will also have two guttural characteristics as well, that is the shift of the vocal shawah under the guttural to the hatef pathic. If you know your weak verbs from the previous discussion in this chapter, you're simply going to be adding the weak verb features together. In our second example, the third he one guttural verb Allah, to go up, you'll see again that it's a third he verb, and so it maintains all of the third he weak verb features. Additionally, in the 2MP and 2FP forms, the expected vocal shawah under the first root letter has shifted to hatef pathic because of the guttural in that root position. So these aren't too bad. These are both the verbs ra'ah and Allah are high frequency verbs in the Hebrew Bible. But if you memorize the strong verb paradigm and you know the principles behind the changes, you'll be able to apply those principles over and over again. You don't want to memorize weak verb paradigms because you can never keep all of that information efficiently in your mind. You'll bog down that mental hard drive. You want to know the strong verb paradigm like a robot, and then all of the weak verb features that can appear in a verb and know why they appear. Let's now move to biconsonantal verbs. So far in our study of the weak verb, we've talked about triconsonantal verbs, or verbs with 3 root letters that have 1 or more weaknesses in them. We now move to the weak verb category, biconsonantal verbs, that is, verbs with only 2 root consonants. Biconsonantal verbs have 2 rather than 3 root consonants. Biconsonantal verbs are further classified by their medial vowel letters. Now, you'll learn in your vocabulary that the lexical form for a biconsonantal form is the infinitive construct, not the cal perfect form with other verbs, and that there are 3 classes of biconsonantal verb: the Shurik biconsonantal verb, the Hirik Yod biconsonantal verb, and the Holam Wow biconsonantal verb, or the U class, I class, and O class, each characterized by the medial vowel letter you see highlighted here in red with kum, seam, or bo. Now in the cal perfect 3MS, you won't see that medial vowel letter. You'll only see kam, sam, or ba. So you'll have to connect the cal perfect 3MS form with the lexical form for now until we can see other forms with that. In the cal perfect, the medial vowel letter therefore does not appear in any form, as we'll see now. With biconsonantal verbs, we're only going to have 2 root consonants. We're going to have comets under the first root consonant in all third-person forms, and pathic under the first root consonant in second and first-person forms. So let's look at some of these verbs together. In the first category, we have our U-class category, or kum. You'll see that in each of the forms there are only 2 root letters, the kof and the mem, followed by the perfect sufformative. Now the perfect sufformatives in each case are identical to the strong verb, and so if you have memorized your cal perfect strong verb, you'll be able to quickly identify the person, gender, and number of each form. So let's work through this first paradigm together to get a sense for how these verbs operate. Kam, kama, kamta, kamt, kamti, kamu, kamten, kamten, kamnu. In each instance, we have only 2 root letters, but we have all of the perfect sufformatives in good shape. So you'll know that because there are 2 root letters, these are biconsonantal verbs. We also have the Hirik Yod, or I class, and the Holam Wow, or O class. Now both the U class kum and the I class seam are inflected exactly the same. However, the O class here, bo, is doubly weak. It's both biconsonantal and the second root consonant is aleph. Therefore, you get a quiescent aleph in each of the forms, and so the dogish lene will drop out of the perfect sufformative, and the expected pathic under many forms will lengthen to comets. In fact, you can see in each of the forms of this paradigm, there is a comet under the first root letter because the aleph is quiescent, which causes the pathic to lengthen to comets. Before we conclude our study of the cal perfect weak verb, I want to review 3 very important weak verb categories. These are the cal perfect verbs with only 2 root consonants in certain inflected forms. And the question is, how do you reconstruct or identify the original root letters when you see only 2 rather than 3 root consonants in the inflected form? In order to do this, you need to be aware of the weak verb DNA and your Hebrew CSI skills. One of the ways in which we can do this is just compare the 3 paradigms that appear on the screen now. With third hey verbs, we have a Hirik Yod stem vowel in all second and first person forms, and we have that strong tau in the third feminine singular form. These 2 features, the Hirik Yod stem vowel and the strong tau in the 3FS form, distinguish third hey verbs from the geminate or biconsonantal class. So it's really that Hirik Yod stem vowel that's going to help you to identify or properly reconstruct third hey verbs. And if you understand that third hey verbs were originally third yod, that Hirik Yod will remind you of that yod in each instance. With geminate verbs, you'll see that in the second and first person, there's a dogish forte in the geminate consonant and a Holam Wow connecting vowel. Those 2 features are distinguishing the geminate verb category from both third hey or biconsonantal. There is no holum vowel connecting vowel in the third hey. There is no holum vowel connecting vowel in the biconsonantal. That doggish forte in the geminate consonant and the holum vowel connecting vowel will help you to properly reconstruct those verbs as geminate. Finally, in the biconsonantal weak verb class, we're going to identify this verb by the process of elimination. There's no heric yod stem vowel. There's no doggish forte in the geminate consonant. There's no holum vowel connecting vowel. Because of that, we can properly identify these as biconsonantal. It's very important that you're able to reconstruct these verbal roots because the verbal root contains the semantic information. And you can't look up the word in the lexicon without the verbal root. So you need to know what are the root letters. That's why in parsing, it's always important to identify the root letters. If you can, on this page, distinguish between third hey, geminate, and biconsonantal verbs, you'll be in good shape for reconstructing verbal roots, and you'll have your Hebrew CSI skills sharp. Finally, before we move on, let me just identify a couple other high-frequency verbs that you should give some special attention to. The first verb is the verb nathan, to give. You'll observe in this paradigm, highlighted in red, that the noon in third root position has assimilated as a doggish forte into the tau of the perfect sufformative. Now, we covered that back in chapter 13, but it's important to review that because this is a high-frequency verb in Biblical Hebrew. Our next verb is the verb to be, haya. This verb is both one guttural and third hey. It inflects exactly like a third hey verb in each instance, except for the 2MP and the 2FP, where the expected vocal schwa has changed to hatef sagol, because the guttural cannot take vocal schwa. You should be able to identify this verb without too much trouble. Our third verb is to fear, yare, and you'll observe in almost every weak verb category, except the 3FS and the 3CP, there is a sere stem vowel followed by a quiescent aleph. We haven't encountered this yet, but it's a possibility, and so with this particular high-frequency verb, you need to become familiar with that. Also, because the aleph is quiescent, it has caused the doggish lene to fall out of the perfect sufformative. But you've seen that almost half a dozen times now, and it shouldn't give you any trouble. Finally, the verb to die, muth, has a number of spelling weaknesses. First is the E-class vowel that appears under the first root letter in the third person form. It's meth, metha, and methu. That sere vowel under the first root letter is highly irregular. Additionally, in all of the other remaining forms that I've highlighted in red, the tau of the verbal root has assimilated as a doggish forte into the tau of the perfect sufformative. And this will make it very difficult to reconstruct the verbal root because now you're simply left with a mem, no shurik, no tau. You'll have to identify the doggish forte in the tau of the perfect sufformative as the tau of the verbal root. So before you move on, here's what you need to do or know. First, above all, make certain that you have memorized the cal perfect strong verb paradigm with absolute precision, like a robot. You shouldn't be working through the weak verbs in this chapter without first having memorized that paradigm. Second, make certain that you understand the types of spelling changes that occur in each of the different weak verb classes. The vast majority of changes that you encounter with these verbs, you've already encountered with nouns. And you're going to encounter them more and more as we progress through the chapters with other weak verbs. So if you know them now, you'll know them later, and what you study later will be much easier to encounter. Finally, memorize those diagnostic spelling features that will allow you to identify and reconstruct weak verbs that appear with only 2 root letters in the cal perfect. This is perhaps one of the most important skills in this chapter, to take those 3 verbs that have only 2 root letters in certain inflected forms and to be able to reconstruct those verbal roots based on what you know from those verbs, the third hey, the geminate, and the biconsonantal classes. You should take some extra time to get to know those verbs and how they're distinct one from another and how you can properly reconstruct the verbal root. That brings our study of the cal perfect weak verbs to a conclusion. Welcome to the lecture for Basics of Biblical Hebrew, Chapter 15, Cal Imperfect Strong Verbs. In this lecture, we will cover the basic function of the imperfect or prefix conjugation. We will take a look at the Cal imperfect strong verb paradigm and work to memorize it. We will cover Cal imperfect stative verbs, and then we will consider the negative particles lo and al with the imperfect. Before we look at the imperfect paradigm, let's consider some of the facts about this particular conjugation. The imperfect conjugation is sometimes called the prefix conjugation because a unique set of prefixes are added to every form of the verb. These are also called preformatives. In chapter 13, we had the Cal perfect verb and we added subformatives to those verbs. With the imperfect, we're going to add both preformatives and then subformatives to some forms. Next, verbal aspect in the imperfect signifies an action for which the conclusion is not in view. To state it differently, aspect in the imperfect denotes incomplete action, whether in the past, present, or future. So the imperfect is the counterpart to the perfect. The perfect denotes completed action, the imperfect denotes incomplete action. Finally, the imperfect is translated by the English present tense, as in I study, or future tense, I will study. The action of the verb occurs either at the time of speaking or after the time of speaking. It is also used to denote habitual or customary action, whether in the past, present, or future. Something like he prays regularly or he used to pray. The imperfect may also be rendered by one of several modal values like would, could, should, may, might, and can. The imperfect is really an all-purpose verb in Hebrew. In terms of frequency, the perfect verb occurs about 21,000 times in the Hebrew Bible, and the imperfect verb occurs even more, about 31,000 times in the Hebrew Bible. This verb is very flexible in terms of its function, and we're going to begin by learning one of its major functions in this chapter, the imperfective aspect. Let's look together at the Cal imperfect strong verb paradigm, and once again, you've got to memorize this paradigm like a robot. We'll begin with a third person singular, move to the second person and then first person singular, and then on to the plural, third person, second person, first person. Remember that with Hebrew paradigms, we work from 3-2-1 singular, then 3-2-1 plural, which is different than English, where we normally work 1-2-3 singular and 1-2-3 plural. Let's take a look at the paradigm together and work through it to pronounce it. We'll begin at the top with a third masculine singular, yiktol, tiktol, tiktol, tiktali, ektol, yiktalu, tiktolna, tiktalu, tiktolna, niktol. Those are the 10 forms of the Cal imperfect strong verb. Let me point out a couple important features of this paradigm before we move on to consider other things. First, there are two sets of forms that are identical to each other. And this makes paradigm memorization easier, but then when you see them in context, you're going to have to decide which one it is. The first one is the 3FS and the 2MS. They're both tiktol. And then the 3FP and the 2FP, tiktolna. You can see that those forms are identical in their spelling, and so in context you'll have to make a decision, and usually it's not that hard. Additionally, you'll observe that every form has a preformative attached to the front. This is the prefix that will help you identify the person, gender, and number of the verb. You also have 5 forms that take subformatives. The 2FS, the 3MP, again the 3FP and the 2FP, as well as the 2MP. Each of those forms takes a subformative. So every form will take a preformative, and 5 forms will take a subformative. The subformatives and the preformatives are also highlighted for you in the columns that are on either side of the verb. You don't have to memorize those as separate realities. You simply need to memorize that imperfect paradigm. Let's say it again together. Yiktol, tiktol, tiktol, tiktali, ektol, yiktalu, tiktolna, tiktalu, tiktolna, niktol. Memorize this paradigm like a robot. Every consonant, vowel, dogish lane, and accent mark. There are 2 forms that have the accent mark. The twin 3FP and 2FP forms have accent marks, and so you'll need to place the accent mark on each of those forms when you're reciting the paradigm. Let's consider some diagnostics and notes. We've already mentioned some of these, but we need to be very careful that we have all the details down for this paradigm. First, it's important to note that there is a heroic preformative vowel in all forms except the 1CS. In the 1CS, you have a Segol preformative vowel under the olive. Also, there is a holum stem vowel in all forms except where it has reduced to vocal schwa in the 2FS, 3MP, and 2MP forms when the sufformative is a vowel letter, shurik or hirik yod. It might be helpful to know at this point that when it comes to the stem vowel in Hebrew, it does the opposite of what you would expect a noun to do. With nouns, an open pretonic syllable is long. But if you have an open pretonic syllable in a stem vowel in a Hebrew verb, it likes to reduce to vocal schwa. Thirdly, there are two identical sets of forms, and we've covered those, the 3FS and 2MS, the 3FP and the 2FP, and that will make memorizing this paradigm a little easier. It's also important to understand that the third person plural is inflected for gender. In the Cal perfect strong verb paradigm, the third person plural was common, katalu. In the imperfect, the third person plural has gender. There's a masculine and a feminine form, yiktalu in the 3MP and tiktolna in the 3FP. Finally, the 3MP and 2MP forms may be written with a final noon, as in yiktalun or tiktaloon. This occurs about 320 times. This final noon is called the noon paragogicum, or a fancy term for an extra noon. Let's look at some other Cal perfect strong verb paradigms together just to get a sense of the consistency with which this paradigm will apply to other verbs. Like the perfect, when you inflect other Cal imperfect strong verbs, you're going to get the exact same vocalization that you have with the paradigm verb katal. Let's look at the verb to remember. I'll work through this paradigm and you can hear the similarity between this verbal paradigm and the one with katal that we did for our strong verb master paradigm. Yizkor, tizkor, tizkor, tizkari. Ezkor, yizkaru. Tizkorna, tizkaru. Tizkorna, nizkor. The only difference between this paradigm and the one for katal are the three root letters that appear in each slot. The vocalization, or the vowels, are the exact same. The same applies to the verb to write, to keep, or to gather, and you can work through those paradigms and pronounce them to kind of get the rhythm for how each one sounds with the unique preformatives and subformatives that identify person, gender, and number. Now let's take a look at stative verbs in the imperfect. With the imperfect inflection of stative verbs, the stem vowel is pathic regardless of the stem vowel in the perfect. You'll recall from our study of stative verbs in the perfect that there were three classes of stative verb based on the stem vowel. There was the pathic stative, the seri stative, and the holum stative. And you can see that in our examples to the left. Gadal is our pathic stative, kaved is our seri stative, and katon is our holum stative. And they have that class or that designation because of the stem vowel highlighted in red. Well, regardless of the class or the stem vowel in the perfect, in the imperfect, the stem vowel is always going to be the short A-class vowel, pathic. Let's look at our examples. Yigdal, yikbad, yiktan. In each case, the stem vowel highlighted in red is pathic. So in the perfect, the stem vowel will be variable with a stative verb, but in the imperfect, there's consistency. It's always the pathic stem vowel with stative verbs. Let's look at the full paradigm for each of the stative verbs in the Cal imperfect. We have the pathic stative, the seri stative, and the holum stative. And you'll notice that in each paradigm, the stem vowel is the short A vowel, pathic, except where it has reduced, where you have the vocalic sufformative. Let's look at the first one together, yigdal. We'll say it together so you get a sense of how it sounds with the A-class vowel. Yigdal, tigdal, tigdal, tigdali. Egdal, yigdalu. Tigdalna, tigdalu, tigdalna, nigdal. And the same will be true for the seri and the holum statives. They will maintain the A-class stem vowel throughout. You need to realize that in the imperfect then that the stem vowel is going to be variable. The regular verb or the strong verb will be the O-class stem vowel holum, and then the stative verbs will have the A-class vowel pathic. Parsing. The parsing of imperfect verbs involves the identification of verbal stem, conjugation, person, gender, number, and lexical form or verbal root. These are the exact same categories that we encountered for the perfect. And remember, always give the information in the proper order. So we have two examples below. We have the form yishma'u. which is the cal imperfect 3MP. The lexical form is shamar, or the verbal root is shin, mim, resh. Our second example, yimlok, is cal imperfect 3MS. From malak, the lexical form, or the verbal root, mim, lamed, kaf. Now you should note that the only way you're going to be able to identify the person and the gender and the number of each imperfect verb is because you've memorized that paradigm and you know the preformatives and possibly the subformatives that go with each form. Before we bring this lecture to an end, we're going to consider the negative particles lo and al. With the perfect, we consider the negative particle lo, and that's the particle that negates the perfect verb. With the imperfect, we have lo again, but we also have al. There are two options for negating an imperfect verb in Hebrew. Let's consider those together. First, with the imperfect, the negative particle lo may be used for an absolute or permanent prohibition. It's a little bit of a stronger negative. So we have our example here, lo tirtzak, you shall not kill. This is from the Decalogue in Exodus 20, and it's an absolute or permanent prohibition. It's something that doesn't change. With the imperfect, the negative particle al may be used for an immediate or specific prohibition, something right away or right then. It may not be durative. Our example is al tira, do not fear, from Genesis 15. This doesn't mean that there's never a time where you shouldn't fear. This just means right now in this immediate situation, you don't need to fear. So lo for durative or ongoing prohibitions, permanent prohibitions, and al for immediate and specific prohibitions. This is something that we don't necessarily have in English, a way to distinguish between these two types of prohibitions. And so here's something with the Hebrew language that can help you understand the nature of a prohibition in a text. So before you move on from this chapter, what must you do or know? First, memorize the cal imperfect strong verb paradigm with absolute precision, like a robot. Master every consonant, vowel, and accent mark, and make sure you know where those identical forms appear. Next, understand the basic translation value for the imperfect or prefix conjugation. For now, we'll start with the basic future tense in English or present tense. Next, remember that the stem vowel for the imperfect stative verb is pathic in every class. Finally, be able to explain the difference between lo and al when negating an imperfect verb. Once you've done that, you're ready to move on to the next chapter. So this concludes our treatment of the cal imperfect strong verb. Welcome to the lecture for Basics of Biblical Hebrew, Chapter 16, Cal Imperfect Weak Verbs. In this lecture, we will cover the various spelling features of weak verbs in the Cal Imperfect. You should note in this chapter, paradigm memorization is not required. Rather, it will be important to understand the variations and patterns of spelling encountered with weak verbs. The principles learned in this chapter will apply throughout the remaining chapters. Now, when it comes to imperfect verbs, we're going to have slightly more weak features with those verbs because we're adding things to the front and to the back of the verb. With the perfect, we were only adding things to the back, and so we provoked some changes, but not as much as we're going to see with the imperfect. Because we're adding preformatives and subformatives, there's going to be a little more variation in weak verb patterns. The key, however, is this. Know your strong verb paradigm like a robot. Every accent and vowel point. Then when it comes to weak verbs, we'll learn the principles of those weak verbs. For example, those things that occur with gutturals or geminate verbs or third hey verbs. And you can apply that throughout the rest of the grammar. In fact, most of the information that we're about to cover you've already had. There will be some new information, but once we've worked through this chapter, really, we're simply going to be applying and reapplying what you've learned here for weak verbs in all of the subsequent chapters. For this reason, chapter 16 is an important chapter. We'll begin with one guttural verbs, as you see on your screen. With one guttural verbs, there are three types, and we've labeled them type 1, type 2, and type 3. What puts each of these verbs in a slightly different category is the preformative vowel. With type 1 verbs, the preformative vowel is sagol, as you'll see here. With type 2 verbs, the preformative vowel is pathic. And then with type 3 verbs, the preformative vowel is holum. Now, with the type 3 verb category, this only applies to one aleph verbs. And there are only 6 one aleph verbs that follow this pattern, but they occur with tremendous frequency. So this type 3 category is very, very important. With type 1 verbs, we're going to see a segol performative vowel and a hatef segol under the first root letter in most forms. This is a bit of a change from the strong verb pattern, but you know that a guttural in first root position provokes certain changes because of that guttural's weakness, and we're going to need to become familiar with seeing this difference in vocalization. If you know your strong verb paradigm and the preformative consonant and the subformatives, which don't change, you'll be just fine in identifying these verbs. The variation in vocalization shouldn't give you any trouble, and so you don't need to memorize any paradigms to master this. The same is true for the type 2. Instead of segol, hatef, segol, you have pathic, hatef, pathic in most of the forms. Now there is some variation, for example, in the 1CS where it moves back to segol, or in the 3MP where the vowel under the first root letter is pathic. But again, it's not important to memorize these particular changes, just that the one guttural verbs provoke these types of changes. And since you know one guttural verbs already do weird things, you shouldn't be caught off guard by this particular environment. With type 3 verbs, it's important to know that the aleph in first root position has become quiescent. Now, that doesn't mean too much, except now you've got that holum followed by an aleph with nothing under it. So it just takes a while to get used to seeing that. Let's now turn our attention to two guttural verbs, third chet ayin verbs, and third aleph verbs. With these verbs, you're going to get either a pathic stem vowel, a hatef pathic for vocal schwa, or a quiescent aleph. Now, pathic stem vowel. You know that gutturals prefer A-class vowels. That's one of the three kind of rules or patterns for gutturals. They don't take a dogish forte or lene, they can't take a vocal schwa, and they prefer A-class vowels. Because of that, if you have a guttural in second or third root position, the regular O-class stem vowel can change to an A-class stem vowel. In that case, it will look something like a stative verb. But as long as you know the stem vowel is variable between O and A, you shouldn't have any trouble. You'll also observe that where you might have had a vocal schwa with some of these forms, you're going to have a hatef pathic, like in the 2FS, 2 guttural, the 3MP, 2 guttural, and the 2MP, 2 guttural. In the third chet ayin category, all of the strong verb diagnostics remain except for the pathic stem vowel. And in the third aleph category, you'll see the comet's stem vowel and a quiescent aleph, something we've already seen with the Cal Perfect. Note that with the 3FP and the 2FP forms, you have a segol stem vowel. That is certainly irregular, but it shouldn't cause you any problem because you can identify the verbal root, mim, tzadi, aleph, and the preformative and subformatives are identical to the strong verb. Good, those are the two guttural, third chet ayin, and third aleph verbs. There are a number of minor changes in these paradigms, but nothing that should prevent you from identifying them in context. Let's look at one yod verbs and the verb halak. Now the reason we're going to throw halak in here is because it's a verb that doesn't follow its own rules. The verb halak inflects like a one yod verb. Now it's a very common verb, and the rule is that which is most common is most irregular. And so you've got to throw halak into the one yod category in order to identify it. With one yod verbs, there are two types, the type 1 and the type 2. And you'll see the basic difference is the preformative vowel. In the type 1 verb, there's a seri preformative vowel. And in the type 2 verb, there's a hirik yod stem vowel. Let's look at the rules together with these. First, there's a loss of the first root consonant. That is, in the one yod category, the yod of the verbal root will drop out every time, and you'll just have the preformative attached to the second root letter. Type 1 verbs have a seri preformative vowel in every form. And type 2 have a hirik yod preformative vowel in every form, and that's how you'll distinguish them. Now with the one yod verb yashav, yod, shin, beit, you'll see that the first root consonant yod has dropped off in every form, and the preformative attaches directly to the second root letter. Yeshev, teshev, teshev, teshvi, eshev, yeshvu, teshavna, teshavu, teshavna, neshev. Now, how do you reconstruct a verbal root like this when you've lost a root letter? The key here is this. The seri preformative vowel is diagnostic or distinctive of the one yod weak verb category. If you see a seri preformative vowel and only 2 root letters, you know that it's a one yod verb. That's the evidence that it's a one-yod verb. That's the diagnostic feature. So if you have to go into your Hebrew CSI mode and reconstruct a verbal root, that sere is what will diagnose the one-yod weak verb category. The verb halak inflects in just the same way. Let's look at it together. Yelek, telek, telek, teleki, alek, etc. You'll see that in each of those forms, you also have a sere preformative vowel and a loss of the he root letter. You'll have to associate the verb halak with the one-yod weak verb class. With the type 2 class, you'll have a heric yod preformative vowel in every instance. Yirash, tirash, tirash, tirashi, irash. Now the nice thing about this particular form is that heric yod stem vowel will remind you that it's a one-yod verb. This is a very easy verb to reconstruct. You'll see 2 yods in a row, or a tau in a yod, or preformative in a yod, and that second yod will remind you that this is a one-yod weak verb, even though it's a heric yod vowel and not a consonant anymore. Now those look like some pretty significant changes, but as long as you know how to diagnose the weakness and reconstruct the verbal root, you should have no trouble because the preformative consonants are the same and the suffomatives are identical. Let's move on to one noon and the verb lakak. Now in the one yod category, we had the verb halak inflect like the one yod verb. In the one noon category, we have the verb lakak, to take, inflect like a one noon verb. Again, this verb is very common, so it's slightly irregular. And you know that with a one noon verb, we're probably going to have some assimilation going on of that noon. The same thing is going to happen with the lamed. The lamed is going to assimilate as a dagesh forte. This is the only time a lamed will assimilate in Hebrew. Let's look at the forms together. First, you'll note with one noon verbs that the first root consonant assimilates as a dagesh forte. Sometimes that dagesh forte can be lost because of the application of the rule skinum levi. In certain instances, the noon can be preserved in 2 guttural doubly weak verbs, which we'll see. Let's look at our first paradigm together, the verb nefal, noon, pei, lamed. In this case, you'll see that the noon has assimilated as a dagesh forte in every instance, and it's highlighted with the red consonant and the red dagesh forte here. Let's say these together. Yipol, tippol, tippol, tippali, epol. In these forms, the noon of the verbal root has assimilated into the second root letter, the pei, as a dagesh forte. That dagesh forte is going to help you to reconstruct the verbal root. Notice that there's no sere under the preformative vowel to identify it as one yod. It's the dagesh forte that will tell you this one is one noon. The verb lakak inflects in just the same way. Yikak, tikak, tikak, tikhi, ekak. The lamed in each case is assimilated as a dagesh forte into the second root letter. But you'll see in a number of forms, because the second root letter here, kof, is a skinum leve consonant, that the dagesh forte can drop out. For example, in the 2FS form, in the 3MP form, and in the 2MP form, the dagesh forte of the assimilated noon or lamed has dropped out. Now, you've already had the rule skinum leve. Whenever you have a dagesh forte and a vocal schwa with the same consonant, that dagesh forte can drop out. So this will be a tougher form to reconstruct, but if you know that rule, you'll be on your way. It'll take time. There are 2 ways to approach learning a language. You can memorize a billion paradigms and think you've got the system down, but those paradigms will quickly leave your memory. It's more efficient to memorize the features that are related to the weakness and apply those features as you work through the Hebrew text. It may take you a little longer to get used to seeing those features and to diagnosing them that way, but it promotes longevity and speed later. So invest now and reap the rewards later. Let's look at third hey verbs. Third hey verbs are a very common weak verb class, and they tend to give students some trouble, so we're going to make sure that doesn't happen for us. We'll begin here. Those 5 forms without suffomatives end with sagol hey. And that's a very nice feature because that sagol hey will remind you every time that these verbs are third hey. It'll make identifying the verbal root clean and easy. Secondly, those 5 forms that do take suffomatives drop the hey before the sufformative. So we'll see in the 2FS, the 3MP, the 3FP, the 2MP, and the 2FP that there is no hey present in the spelling of the verb. Here you'll have to reconstruct the verbal root based on knowing your options. It's not one yod because there's no seri preformative vowel. It's not one nun because there's no dogged forte in the second root letter, so it must be third hey. So this is the process of elimination. It's also helpful to remember that third hey verbs used to be third yod. We covered that in the Cal Perfect chapter. And you can see in the 3FP and the 2FP, that yod has reappeared. So you can use that yod to reconstruct the verbal root. Now that yod will appear with some other forms, but predominantly it will mark the third hey weak verb category. Geminate verbs. You know that geminate verbs have identical second and third root letters. In the imperfect, the geminate consonant is always lost. Sometimes it reappears as a dogged forte, sometimes it does not. Let's look together at some of the rules that govern geminate verbs. First, there's the loss of the geminate consonant in every form. So you'll never see three root letters with the geminate verb. Secondly, the geminate consonant may reappear as a dogged forte in forms with suffirmatives. So when you add something to the end of the verb, that geminate consonant may reappear as a dogged forte. But if there's no suffirmative, you can't put a dogged forte in the last letter of any word. That would double the last letter, and Hebrew does not like a doubly closed syllable. You can only have one consonant at the end of a word. And finally, the type 2 geminate verb is completely weird, and you'll have to manage that form by looking it up in a lexicon or by using one of the electronic resources that identify verbs for you. We're going to focus on the type 1 geminate verb because that is the most common type. Let's say a few of these forms together. Yasov, tasov, tasov, tasobi, asov. In the type 1 geminate category, you'll see a comets preformative vowel in every form except the 3FP and 2FP where it has undergone propretonic reduction. You'll also see the O-class vowel between the first and second root letter. In those forms that take suffirmatives, the geminate consonant will reappear as a dogged forte, and that's a nice feature because that dogged forte will help you to reconstruct the geminate verbal root. So in the 2FS, in the 3MP, in the 3FP, the 2MP, and the 2FP, the geminate consonant has reappeared as a dogged forte. We now turn our attention to biconsonantal verbs. As you know, biconsonantal verbs have 2 rather than 3 root consonants. You also know that biconsonantal verbs are further classified by their medial vowel letters, the shurik, the hirik yod, and the holem wow. You see those in the examples to the right, kum, seem, and bo. In the Cal imperfect, the medial vowel letter is present in every form. Now I highlight that because that is different or distinct from the Cal perfect. In the Cal perfect, the medial vowel letter is gone. In the Cal imperfect, the medial vowel letter is present in every form. And so it's easy to identify the lexical form for this particular verb. Let's look at the biconsonantal verbal paradigms. Note that there are 2 root consonants with the medial vowel letter in every form and a comets preformative vowel in almost every form, except where you have propretonic reduction in the 3MP and the 2FP forms. Let's begin by looking at kum together, and we'll pronounce yakum, takum, takum, takumi, akum. You'll observe that there is a comets preformative vowel in every form. The medial vowel letter highlighted in red makes identification of the lexical form easy, and the suffirmatives have not changed at all in any of those 5 forms. So the preformative consonant and the suffirmatives are unchanged. The preformative vowel is now comets. The same applies to the hirik yod class, yasim, tasim, tasim, tasimi, asim. The only difference here is that the medial vowel letter is hirik yod because seem is a I class or hirik yod class biconsonantal. Finally, we have the O class or holem wow class, yavo, tavo, tavo, tavo-i, avo. Once again, comets preformative vowel in those forms, holem wow medial vowel letter, and then all the required preformatives and suffirmatives. With biconsonantal verbs in the imperfect, it's easy to identify their lexical form and to parse them because all the parts are present. At the end of our lecture for chapter 14, we paused to consider those weak verbs that lose a verbal root in the inflection of the perfect. We needed to do that because we had to reconstruct verbal roots, and rather than just guessing, we wanted to take the time to point out how you know which weak verbal class you should be reconstructing in each instance. We looked for the diagnostic clues that would kind of fuel your Hebrew CSI skills. We want to do the same thing here with the imperfect. There are 4 weak verb classes in the imperfect where you'll see only 2 root letters. The question then becomes, which weak verb class does it belong to, or how do you reconstruct that verbal root so you know what it means and how to identify the verbal root? Here's how it works. In the 1-yod weak verb class, you'll see that there's a tseri preformative vowel in every form. That tseri preformative vowel will tell you to reconstruct the verbal root as 1-yod. In the 1-nun category, you see a dogish forte appearing now in the 2nd root letter. That dogish forte is the assimilated nun of the verbal root. If you understand that that's the assimilated nun of the verbal root, you can reconstruct this verb as a 1-nun verb. With third hey verbs, those 5 forms that don't take suffirmatives will appear with segol hey, and that will tell you it's third hey. Then, by process of elimination, you'll understand that there's no tseri preformative vowel, there's no dogish forte in the remaining 2nd root letter, therefore it must be third hey. So third hey, you identified those 5 forms that drop the hey by a process of elimination. And with geminate verbs, you'll identify those verbs as having a comets preformative vowel and then a dogish forte in the geminate consonant with those forms that take a suffirmative. So in each weak verb class that drops a root letter, there's a distinctive feature in that class to help you understand which one to reconstruct. When I was learning Hebrew, I had no such clues, and I just had to begin making up verbs to look up. I added a hey to see if it was third hey. I added a nun to see if it was 1-nun. I added a yod to see if it was 1-yod, and it took forever. There's no guessing necessary. Each weak verb class that drops a root letter has a distinctive feature that can help you reconstruct the verbal root without having to guess. So before you move on, what must you do or know? First, make certain that you have memorized the Cal imperfect strong verb paradigm with absolute precision. You'll never be able to identify verbal weaknesses if you don't know the paradigm against which to measure it. Second, make certain that you understand the types of spelling changes that occur in each of the different weak verb classes. Build your arsenal of knowledge in terms of what particular weak verbs do. Finally, memorize those diagnostic spelling features that will allow you to identify and reconstruct those weak verbs that appear with only 2 root letters in the Cal imperfect. In fact, in this chapter, that may be the most important skill that you can develop, reconstructing verbal roots that have lost a root letter. Well, that brings our study of chapter 16, the Cal imperfect weak verb, to an end. Welcome to the lecture for Basics of Biblical Hebrew, Chapter 17, the while consecutive. In this lecture, we will cover the form and function of the while consecutive and the consecutive verbal forms, and the temporal modifiers, wahi and wahaya. In this chapter, we're going to basically cover 2 special uses of the perfect and imperfect conjugations, the consecutive use. What's nice about this chapter is that there are no new paradigms to memorize. We're going to be working with the imperfect and the perfect conjugations that you've already studied. What we're going to do in this chapter is talk about 2 additional uses of the perfect and the imperfect. In chapter 13, we covered the perfect conjugation and its completed aspect. And in chapter 15, we covered the imperfect conjugation and its incomplete aspect. Here we're going to talk about another use of these 2 conjugations, the consecutive use. We'll begin by considering the while consecutive with the imperfect. When an imperfect verb is prefixed with the while consecutive, it'll be translated with the values of the perfect verbal form. That's right. The imperfect is going to be translated like a perfect when it takes the while consecutive. Let's look at an example together. On the left, you'll see the form yishmor. This is the Cal imperfect without the while consecutive, and it's translated, he will observe. Over on the right, you see yishmor. It's the exact same verb. However, you can see now it's prefixed with what is the while consecutive. The while consecutive consists of the conjunction while, a pathic, and a dogish forte in the first consonant of the word to which it's prefixed, in this case the imperfect preformative. Note how it's translated, and he observed. It's translated like the perfect verb with a simple past tense, and he observed. Once again, let me reinforce this with you. The regular imperfect he will observe the future in English. And with the while consecutive and he observed the past in English. In the past, we would talk about this as a converted imperfect. That is, the imperfect has been converted to the perfect translation value. We don't use that language anymore, but it is descriptive of what happens to the meaning of the verb when you prefix the while consecutive to it. Let's look at another example. Our second example, yizkor, translated he will remember, and then yizkor with the while consecutive, translated and he remembered, simple past. The while consecutive is a special form of the conjunction while prefixed to the imperfect verb. It is spelled with a pathic and a dogish forte. Let's look at the while consecutive with the full paradigm of the imperfect. The vocalization of the while consecutive should remind you of the definite article. Let's consider the paradigm together on the right. Why yiktol, why tiktol, why tiktol, why tiktali, what ektol, why yiktalu, why tiktolna, why tiktalu, why tiktolna, why niktol. You will observe that in every form of this paradigm, the spelling of the imperfect verb is unchanged. What is different is that we've prefixed the while consecutive to the imperfect, which consists of the while, the pathic, and the dogish forte. The only minor difference to consider is that in those forms that begin with a tau, the dogish lene has become a dogish forte. Also, in the 1CS form, you understand that the guttural olive has rejected the dogish forte and caused compensatory lengthening. The pathic has lengthened to commas. This is something you've seen on numerous occasions, and it should not give you any trouble. That's the while consecutive with the imperfect conjugation. It's simply adding a special form of the conjunction while to the imperfect verb. You can also add the regular conjunction to the imperfect, and this is not the while consecutive. Let's look at the paradigm on the right, and we'll see the imperfect prefixed with the regular conjunction. Wa yiktol, wa thiktol, wa thiktol, wa thiktali, wa ektol, etc. Notice that in every form, the spelling of the conjunction while is not the spelling of the while consecutive. This is the regular conjunction with the imperfect, while plus vocal schwa. The spelling of the while consecutive with the imperfect is while pathic dogish forte. This is an important distinction to remember. All of these verbs are translated just like the regular imperfect, and he will kill, and she will kill, etc. There are a few verbs that experience minor spelling changes with the prefixing of the while consecutive. Let's look at those together. Here we have spelling changes in the consecutive imperfect. We'll begin with the one olive category. This is the type 3 one olive verb, yomar. When prefixed with the while consecutive, the stem vowel changes to segol. That shouldn't give you any trouble in identifying the form. With the one yod verb, yeshev, once again the stem vowel changes to segol. With biconsonantal verbs, when those verbs are prefixed with the while consecutive, the medial vowel letter is lost, and you will get a corresponding short vowel. Sometimes these are called short forms because the medial vowel letter is lost. So here we get the kamet satuf in wayakam, or the segol in wayasem. And finally, the third hey category, yivneh. When prefixed with the while consecutive, those forms that end in segol hey in the regular imperfect drop that hey when prefixed with the while consecutive. So now we have wayivin. You can see that in each of the forms on the right, the while consecutive forms, I've highlighted the accent mark in red. The reason for this is that one of the things that the prefixing of the while consecutive does is it sucks the accent back as far as possible. And that's what precipitates these changes in the imperfect. These types of changes are fairly common in the Hebrew Bible, but they shouldn't give you too much trouble in terms of identification. The trick will be reconstructing the medial vowel letter for the biconsonantal verbs and restoring that hey for third hey verbs. Let's take a look at the use of the consecutive imperfect, and we're going to look at the three basic uses of the consecutive imperfect. The first use of the consecutive imperfect is for past tense narrative sequences. A past tense narrative sequence may begin with a perfect verb, followed by any number of consecutive imperfect verbs. Each consecutive imperfect verb may be temporally, logically, sequentially, or consequentially related to the preceding verb. Now, think of this. The while consecutive is called consecutive, And so it's going to denote a consecutive sequence of actions related in some way. So in this use, we'll begin with a perfect verb, denoting a completed action, and then we'll follow that with a series of imperfects with while consecutive to string that chain of actions together. Let's look at our example together. Waha'adam yadha, eth chewa, ishto watahar, waiteleth eth kayan. Here's the translation. And the man knew. Here's the cow, perfect, 3ms verb, denoting a completed action. The man knew Eve, his wife. Now here come the consecutive imperfect verbs. And so she conceived, and then she bore a son, Cain. You have 3 verbs in this particular verse. The first verb is the perfect verb. The second 2 verbs are the consecutive imperfect verbs that continue that sequence of verbal actions. This is the first use of the consecutive imperfect to denote a past tense narrative sequence. In addition to the regular past tense narrative sequence that we just observed, we also understand that a past tense narrative sequence may begin with a consecutive imperfect and not a perfect. That is, you don't always need a perfect verb to start the sequence. You can begin these sequences with simply the imperfect verb prefixed with while consecutive. So let's look at our next example. Vayikra el Moshe, Vayidaber Yahweh Elau, Me'ohel Mo'ed. Translated, and he called to Moses, and Yahweh spoke to him from the tent of meeting. Here we have 2 consecutive imperfect verbs that make up the past tense narrative sequence. Notice that we're not translating these imperfect verbs as we did back in chapter 15 with an imperfective value. We're translating them as perfect verbs. Why? Because they're prefixed with the while consecutive. And thirdly, a past tense narrative sequence may begin with the temporal modifier wahi, followed by imperfect verbs with while consecutive. The form wahi is the cal imperfect 3ms of haya, the verb to be, with while consecutive. Let's consider our example below. Wahi, that's the temporal modifier, acharei moth, Avraham, wayivarech, Elohim eth Yitzhak beno. Before I translate it, let me just observe that the temporal modifier appears first in the clause, and it begins the past tense narrative sequence. We could translate it literally something like, and it was, after the death of Moses, but usually we leave it untranslated, simply denoting that the past tense narrative sequence is about to begin after the death of Moses or and after the death of Moses. I'll give you several translation options as we go. And it was, or simply and, after the death of Abraham. Then God blessed Isaac, his son. Here you have a past tense narrative sequence. It begins with a temporal modifier, and it's continued with a series of imperfect verbs prefixed with the while consecutive. So there are 3 different past tense narrative sequences in biblical Hebrew. One, you begin with a perfect, and you continue with consecutive imperfects. Or you can just have a past tense narrative sequence that's a string of consecutive imperfects. Or you can begin with a temporal modifier with a string of consecutive imperfects. As you get into the biblical text and you read more and more, even in the translation of the homework, you'll see how these work together. Now that we've considered the while consecutive with the imperfect, it's time to consider the while consecutive with the perfect. When a perfect verb is prefixed with the while consecutive, it will be translated with the values of an imperfect verbal form. This is exactly what we saw with the imperfect. When the imperfect is prefixed with the while consecutive, you translate it like a perfect. When a perfect is prefixed with the while consecutive, you translate it like an imperfect. These are kind of binary or opposing forms. So you can talk about the non-consecutive perfect and imperfects and the consecutive perfect and imperfects. Look at our examples together. Our first example is the verb shamar, translated he observed. When prefixed with the while consecutive, washamar, it's now translated and he will observe, like the imperfect. Observe. On the left, we have the regular perfect, translated with a simple past tense. And on the right, we have the perfect with the while consecutive, translated like the imperfect with a future tense value in English. Again, and he will observe. You will also see that the while consecutive with the perfect is not spelled like the while consecutive with the imperfect. With the imperfect, the while consecutive is spelled wow, pathic, and dogish forte. Its vocalization is like the definite article, pathic and dogish forte. With the perfect, it's just the simple conjunction wow, wow, vocal schwa. Let's look at our second example. Zakar, he remembered, or was Zakar, and he will remember. Once again, the form on the left is the regular perfect, translated with a simple past, and the form on the right is the consecutive perfect, translated like the imperfect, and he will remember. It's really that simple. Let's look at the while consecutive with the perfect. The while consecutive with the perfect is spelled the same as the regular conjunction wow. Let's look at these forms together. Wakatal, wakatala, wakatalta, wakatalt, wakatalti, wakatalu, ukataltem, ukatalten, wakatalnu. The first thing to observe is that every form of the perfect remains unchanged in its spelling when prefixed with the while consecutive. Secondly, it is helpful to observe that the conjunction wow is spelled as shurik with the 2MP and 2FP forms because it is prefixed to a word that begins with vocal schwa. Lastly, it may help to observe that in the 2MS and the 1CS, the accent mark gets pushed forward to the last syllable. Now that probably won't mean much to most of you, but there are times when that accent mark can help you to distinguish between the regular perfect and the consecutive perfect, so it's good to keep that in the back of your mind. Let's look at the uses of the consecutive perfect together. The first one, a future tense narrative sequence may begin with an imperfect verb followed by any number of consecutive perfect verbs. So if the consecutive imperfect is used for a past tense narrative sequence, a consecutive perfect verb is used for the opposite, the future tense narrative sequence. Let's look at our example. Shesheth yamim ta'avod wa'asitha kol malaktacha. Translated, 6 days you will labor, imperfect 2MS, and you will do perfect 2MS with while consecutive, all of your work. Notice here that we have an imperfect verb followed by a perfect verb with while consecutive, and they maintain the exact same aspectual or tense factor in English translation. You will labor and you will do. Both verbs are translated with the future tense in English, even though one of the verbs, the first one is imperfect, and the second one is perfect. This is how Hebrew strings together consecutive sequences of action. The consecutive verbs function in a different way than the regular perfect or imperfect. The second way in which to construct a future tense narrative sequence relates to the temporal modifier. A future tense narrative sequence may begin with the temporal modifier wahaya, which is the opposite of wahi, the temporal modifier used with the imperfect, followed by perfect verbs with while consecutive. The form wahaya is cal perfect 3MS from the verb haya with while consecutive, the verb to be. Let's look at our example. Wahaya bayom hahu. Washavarti eth kesheth Yisrael. With regard to translation, this temporal modifier can be rendered something like, and it will be in that day, or you can just say, and in that day. We know that what follows will provide us with the future tense narrative sequence that we need. So, and it will be, or simply and, in that day, I will break the bow of Israel. Here we have the temporal modifier wahaya that denotes a future tense narrative sequence, followed by the cal perfect 1CS from shavar with the while consecutive, and this continues the future tense narrative sequence. Finally, the consecutive perfect may follow an imperative verb and be translated with the full force of the initial imperative. You can call this the imperatival use of the consecutive imperfect. Let's look at our example. Shim'u eth divrei habrith hazoth wa'asithim otham. The translation, let's begin with the imperative verb. Hear, the imperative, 2MP, hear what? The words of this covenant, and do them. Here we have a sequence beginning with an imperative verb at the beginning and followed by a consecutive perfect verb in the second person. In this sequence, the consecutive perfect verb is translated just like the imperative verb that begins the sequence. So in this use, the consecutive perfect verb is imperative. Hear and do. This is the third use of the consecutive perfect. So you can have a future tense narrative sequence that begins with an imperfect and continues with consecutive perfects. You can have a future tense narrative sequence that begins with the temporal modifier wahaya and continue that with consecutive perfects. Or the consecutive perfect may function like an imperative when it's in the sequence imperative plus consecutive perfect in the second person. Those are the three uses of the consecutive perfect. Let's look at the perfect with the regular conjunction wow. Now, you may have been thinking already that if the consecutive perfect is identified by prefixing the regular conjunction wow to it, how do I identify when the perfect verb is not consecutive and it takes the regular conjunction wow? Do you understand the question? Let me say it again. If the consecutive perfect is prefixed with the regular conjunction wow, how do I identify a perfect verb that's not consecutive, but it does take the regular conjunction wow? Before I describe the environments in which you can have this situation, let me just note that at a rate of over 90%, when a perfect verb is prefixed with the conjunction wow, it's the consecutive perfect. So begin by always thinking this must be a consecutive perfect. However, there are two environments in which you can have the regular perfect prefixed with the regular conjunction wow and it not be consecutive. This is infrequent, and so we'll say, infrequently, the perfect may appear with the regular conjunction and not with the wow consecutive. The first environment in which that occurs is when you have a short series of perfect verbs that are contiguous or back-to-back. This is our first example. Let me read it for you. Avicha chalo, echal, washatha, wa'asa, mishpat. Translated, as for your father, did he not eat and drink and do justice? Highlighted in red, you will see three perfect verbs. The first one, achal, the regular perfect, there's nothing prefixed to it. But then there are two perfect verbs that follow that, both 3ms, both prefixed with the conjunction. This is one of the environments, this short series of contiguous perfect verbs, where those verbs are not consecutive perfects. They're all regular perfects. Let's look at the second example. In the second example, we have two parallel lines from Isaiah 6:7. Hene nara ze al, sefathecha wasar awonecha. Translated, behold, he touched this upon your lips, and he removed your iniquity. In this case, we have two poetic lines with two perfect verbs. And because they're related in terms of parallelism, we're going to translate them the same way. So if you have a short series of contiguous perfects, or if you have two parallel lines in poetry that are matching one to the other in terms of their verbs, those are the only two environments in which you'll get a regular perfect prefixed with the conjunction, not the wow consecutive. Parsing. The parsing of the consecutive verbal form is just like the parsing of any regular perfect or imperfect, except that you must identify the presence of the wow consecutive in your parsing. So let's look at our examples together. In the first one, we have wayishmor. This is the kal imperfect 3ms from the verb shamar, shin, mem, resh, and then you just simply say with wow consecutive. We have a new column for you to add the parsing information. The second one was a car. This is the kal perfect 3ms from the verb zakar, zayin, kaf, resh, with the wow consecutive. So make sure that when you're parsing your perfect and imperfect verbs, that you clearly identify if they appear with the wow consecutive. Before you move on, what must we do or know? First, carefully memorize the form and function of the wow consecutive with the imperfect and perfect conjugations. Remember that with the imperfect, the wow consecutive is spelled wow, pathic, dogish forte. With the perfect conjugation, it's the simple conjunction wow, vocal schwa. Second, become familiar with the few spelling changes that occur with the consecutive imperfect, especially third hay and biconsonantal when those forms are shortened. Third, become familiar with the ways in which Hebrew constructs future and past tense narrative sequences with the consecutive verbal forms and the temporal modifiers wayahi and wahaya. This concludes our lecture for Chapter 17, the wow consecutive with imperfect and perfect verbs. Welcome to the lecture for Basics of Biblical Hebrew, Chapter 18, the Cal imperative. In this lecture, we will cover the imperative conjugation in the Cal stem with both strong and weak verbs. This will be our third Hebrew conjugation. We'll also discuss negation of the imperative, the particle na, and important verbal sequences with the imperative conjugation. Let's look at some of the basics together before we move on to the paradigm. First, the imperative is used primarily to express direct commands. It can also be used to grant permission or to communicate a request. The Hebrew imperative occurs only in the second person. There are therefore only 4 forms to study: masculine singular and plural, feminine singular and plural. And the 4 forms of the imperative are related to their corresponding imperfect forms. So if you know your imperfect paradigm, the imperative forms are going to be easy to identify. On your screen now, you will see the Cal imperative strong verb paradigm. Note there are only 4 forms: the second masculine singular, the second feminine singular, the second masculine plural, the second feminine plural, all translated the same way: you parenthetically kill. In English, you don't need to use the 2ms personal pronoun in each instance. Let's rehearse this paradigm together. Katol, kitli, kitlu, katolna. Once again, katol, kitli, kitlu, katolna. You'll see that 3 of the forms, the 2fs, 2mp, and 2fp, have suffirmatives that should remind you of the imperfect. The 2ms form does not have a suffirmative. The imperfect and the imperative are related in terms of their form. In fact, you can form the imperative by taking the 4 imperfect forms in the second person, slicing off the preformative, and then you have the basic imperative form. Let's look together at the chart and see how that works. Here in the left-hand column, we have the 4 second-person imperfect forms: tiktol, tiktali, tiktalu, and tiktolna. Then in our middle column, we slice off the red imperfect preformatives, and we're left with the basic form of the imperative. There are only 2 slight changes. In the 2fs form and the 2mp form, you'll see that when you slice off the imperfect preformative, you're left then with 2 shawahs at the beginning of a word. And you understand that you can't have 2 shawahs at the beginning of a word. So rule of shawah 1 results in kitli and kitlu, a heroic in a closed syllable. So if you've mastered your imperfect paradigm in the strong verb, the imperative paradigm for the strong verb will be easy to memorize. Now let's look at a few of the weak verbs with the imperative to make sure we understand the changes that appear with these verbs. Because you've already studied weak verbs in the imperfect, you'll know most of the changes that appear here. However, the imperative does maintain some of its own unique spelling changes. We'll begin with the one guttural category. You'll see that for each of the weak verb categories, we've listed the imperfect verb on the left and then the corresponding imperative verb on the right so that you can compare. We'll begin with the one guttural category, and you'll see that in a number of instances, the vowels at the beginning have slightly changed. So instead of sagol, sagol, now you have the hatef pathic. Or instead of a sagol vowel for the 2fs form, now you'll have a heroic or a heroic, and again the pathic, hatef pathic. These changes shouldn't give you too much trouble because the suffirmatives and the basic spelling are the same. The same happens in the one olive category, where instead of the pathic vowels, you'll get the heroic vowel under the first root letter. Also with 2 guttural verbs, because of the rule of shawah, you'll get a pathic under the first root letter because of rule of shawah 2 with guttural consonants. And finally, with the one olive type 3 verb that we learned in the imperfect, you'll see that the holem vowel normally associated with the preformative is lost, and you'll end up with a hatef sagol or a heroic hatef sagol. Again, I point these changes out to you, not for you to memorize, but just so that you understand there's going to be slight vocalization changes at the beginning of the word. But notice that the imperative suffirmatives never change, and the basic consonantal structure of the verb does not change. So concentrate on what stays the same and understand the rules that govern the changes with gutturals, and you'll be fine. Let's look at a few more weak verbs. What's nice about the third chet ayin that we see on the left or the third aleph that we see on the right is that most of the strong verb diagnostics are maintained. Now in the third chet ayin category, we know that the stem vowel is pathic, and so the stem vowel will be pathic in the imperative. That's the only slight change from the strong verb. With third aleph forms, you know that the stem vowel is comets because of the quiescent aleph, both in the imperfect and the imperative. Everything else is just the same. Now we're going to look at some verbs that drop a root letter. And there are some interesting changes that occur here. You know that with the one noon type 1 verb, nafal, noon, pei, lamed, the noon of the verbal root assimilates as a dagesh forte into the second root letter. Now, when you slice off that imperfect preformative to form the imperative, observe that the noon pops back out in each form of the imperative with this type 1 class. This makes it easy to reconstruct the verbal root. In fact, the imperative has reconstructed it for you. It's inflected just like the strong verb. But in the type 2 class, over here to the right, you'll see that the noon is lost in every form. Not only that, the dagesh forte that normally helped you to identify the one noon weak verb category is also lost. So you'll have to know that the one noon is a potential reconstruction for verbs that have only 2 root letters in the imperfect. Down below the one yod type 1 teshev, you'll see that in each instance it's dropped the imperfect preformative, and that imperfect preformative had the seri preformative vowel that helped you reconstruct the one yod weak verb category. Because of that, you'll have to know that one yod is a potential reconstruction category or option when reconstructing these verbal roots. The same is true for the type 2 one yod verb over on the bottom right, t-rash. When these verbs drop their imperfect preformative, they're going to drop both the preformative and the hierarch yod vowel associated with it. So now these verbs have only 2 root letters present, rash, rashi, etc. You'll have to know that when you see an imperative verb with only 2 root letters, that it could be one noon or one yod at this point. We're now in weak verbs, part 2b, where we get the third hay and geminate verbs. The nice thing about this is that the spelling changes are minimal when it comes to the removal of the imperfect preformative. The major change to observe with third hay verbs is that it now ends with sere hay instead of segol hay with the imperfect. Everything else is pretty much the same after the removal of the imperfect preformative. With geminate verbs, you lose the distinctive comets preformative vowel in each instance when the suffixative is removed. In every other way, the geminate verb is maintained: sov, sobi, sobu, and sovna. There are a number of irregular or doubly weak verbs, and most of these weak verbs are high frequency in the Hebrew Bible. Take some time in your studies to carefully consider each of these verbs and be able to identify which weak verb class they belong to. With the verb nathan, of course, we're going to lose the noon in first root position. You'll have to reconstruct that verbal root. The same applies to halak, because halak inflects like a one yod verb. And so the hay is going to be lost in every form. The same thing will happen to lakak. Because lakak inflects like a one noon verb, that lamed is lost in every form, and we're not used to reconstructing one lamed verbs. You've got to understand that the verb lakak inflects like a one noon. Additionally, it loses the dagesh forte that normally identifies the assimilated lamed in each of the imperative forms, because you cannot put a dagesh forte in the first letter of any word. Finally, the verb haya only appears in the 2ms and 2mp, and it appears to be slightly irregular, but inflects mostly like a third hay verb. Finally, we'll consider the biconsonantal weak verbs with the imperative. The nice thing about this is that the medial vowel letter is present in every form. So once you remove the imperfect preformative, everything else stays the same. For example, with takum, you remove the preformative and you have kum, and then kumi, kumu, and then komna. Easy. You can see the full biconsonantal verb with its medial vowel letter. So bo, bo-e, bo-u, or seem, simi, simu. In each case, the lexical form of the verb is clearly present, and the suffirmatives clearly identify the person, gender, and number of the imperative. The only tricky form will be the 2ms, because the imperative 2ms of the biconsonantal verb will look just like the infinitive construct or lexical form, but context will clearly help you distinguish between those two forms. One interesting feature related to the imperative is that on occasion, the imperative verb will take an extra comets hey ending. This is called the lengthened 2ms imperative. Let's look at some of these examples. Here we have our lexical form katal. The imperative 2ms form is katol. Then there is the alternate 2ms form, the lengthened imperative, kotla. Note that the vowel under the first root letter is a kamet hatuf. It appears in a closed, unaccented syllable. Let's look at example 2, shamar. The imperative 2ms form, shamor. And then the lengthened imperative form, shomra. Again, the vowel under the shin is a kamet hatuf, an O-class vowel in the closed, unaccented syllable. Let's look at our third example, shema. The imperative, shema, with a pathic stem vowel because that guttural prefers the A-class stem vowel. And then shim'a, the lengthened 2ms imperative. Notice that in this case we have a heroic vowel under the first root letter and not the kamet hatuf. It's variable. The following three weak verbs are included because they occur with some frequency in the lengthened imperative form. Lecha, from the verb halak, tena, from the verb nathan, and kuma. The difference in meaning between the regular imperative 2ms and the lengthened imperative 2ms is disputed. For now, you can simply translate them both the same. We now come to negating the imperative. In chapter 13, you learned that we negated the perfect with lo, and then in chapter 15, we considered negating the imperfect with lo or al. What about the imperative? Here it is. How do you negate the imperative? You don't. The imperative is never negated. To produce a negative command, Hebrew does not negate an imperative form. Prohibitions, that is, negative commands, are expressed with the negative particles lo or al and the imperfect. So you will never see any negative particle associated with the imperative. The imperative is only for positive commands, not negative commands or prohibitions. The particle na. There is this little word that pops up in Hebrew with imperatives. It's na. The particle na appears with imperatives and other volitional verbs. Now you'll have to wait to hear about volitional verbs until chapter 23. This particle is translated either as please, now, or it's left untranslated. Like the lengthened imperative, we don't really know fully how this particle functions in each context. So use one of the forms please, now, or just simply leave it untranslated. Let's look at our first example together. Shim'una ha-chalom hazeh. Hear now this dream. Here we have the imperative joined by makef to the particle na. And in this case, we're translating it now. But you could also translate it, please hear or please listen to this dream. It could be either polite or urgent. Let's look at the second example together. Salakna la'awon ha'am hazeh. Please forgive the iniquity of this people. Here we have the imperative salak joined by makef to the particle na. In this case, we're translating it politely, please forgive. You could also say forgive now the iniquity of this people, or simply forgive the iniquity of this people. As you consider some of the standard Bible translations, you will see that different ones do it in different ways. Now we will consider some verbal sequences with the imperative. It's here where we get into some syntax, or how the imperative is used in context. We'll have three basic uses. First, several imperative verbs may occur in succession and are related consequentially or sequentially. So in our first example here, ale ukavor eth avicha. Translated, go up and bury your father. Here we have two imperative verbs joined by wow, describing a series of commands. First, go up, and then bury your father. This is the first verbal sequence that you'll see with imperatives, multiple imperatives in a row. The second use. With the second use, an imperative verb may be followed by a consecutive perfect and carry the full force of the preceding imperative. Now, we talked about this in the last chapter with the while consecutive, but you hadn't had imperatives yet. Now you have the imperative and you can see the full force of the imperative followed by the consecutive perfect. The example is Lake wa amarta el avdi. Go and say to my servant. Here you have the imperative verb followed by the perfect 2ms with while consecutive. When the imperative verb is followed by a second person consecutive perfect, that consecutive perfect will take on the full force of the imperative. It's like you have two imperatives in a row. So go and say to my servant. That's the second verbal sequence with the imperative. The imperative followed by the consecutive perfect. Finally, we have our third important sequence. An imperative may be followed by the regular conjunction and an imperfect, a construction that will create a purpose or result clause translated so that. Let's look at our example below. Radhu shema wa shivru lanu, misham wa nichye. Translated, go down there and buy for us some grain from there so that we might live. In this example, we have two imperative verbs followed by an imperfect prefixed with the regular conjunction while. In this case, we're translating this imperfect verb with the while conjunction as a purpose clause. When you have an imperative verb followed by an imperfect prefixed with a regular conjunction while, it may create a purpose clause, and that's why we're rendering it as so that in our translation. This is the third important verbal sequence with the imperative followed by the imperfect with the regular conjunction while. Parsing. When you parse an imperative verb, it involves the identification of the verbal stem, conjugation, person, gender, number, and lexical form or verbal root, just like the perfect or imperfect. And remember, when parsing, always give the information in the proper order. So here's how it looks with the imperative verb. In our first example, shim'u, cal imperative 2MP from the lexical form shema. Now we know that every imperative verb is second person, but I believe it's always important to give the full label every time in terms of person, gender, and number. The second example, ale, cal imperative 2MS from the verb Allah, ayin, lamed, hey. Very easy. When it comes to parsing information for the imperative, the only thing we're changing is not the stem, the person, gender, number, or lexical form, but it's that conjugation. So far we've had the cal perfect, the imperfect, and now the imperative. You now have three options for information in that second slot when you're parsing. So before you move on, what must you do or know? First, carefully memorize the four forms of the cal imperative strong verb paradigm. It should be easy because it's derived from the imperfect. Carefully work through the various weak verb forms in order to become familiar with the slight changes in spelling. Again, the types of changes that are experienced there are similar to what we had with the imperfect. The difficulty is going to be reconstructing verbal roots that lose a root letter and the diagnostic features that we would normally reconstruct a verb with. You'll have to know your options, one yod or one noon. Finally, be able to identify and understand the long form of the imperative, the particle na, and the important verbal sequences with the imperative. There's really not that much information in this chapter. It's really four forms, an alternative form, and three uses. Once you get the basics down, you're good to go. And this concludes our lecture on Chapter 18, the cal imperative. Welcome to the lecture for Basics of Biblical Hebrew, Chapter 19, Pronominal Suffixes on Verbs. In this lecture, we will cover the fact that pronominal suffixes function as the object of the verb to which they are attached. We also cover how to identify pronominal suffixes on the perfect, imperfect, and imperative verbs. And in general, it's good to know that verbs use type 1 pronominal suffixes. We will also learn about the so-called noon suffixes that may appear with the imperfect and the imperative. In Chapter 9, we covered the fact that pronominal suffixes may be added to nouns, prepositions, and the definite direct object marker. In this chapter, we're going to cover the fact that pronominal suffixes may be attached directly to verbs as the object of the verb. Look at your screen with me. When a pronoun is the direct object of a verb, it is commonly attached to the definite direct object marker as a pronominal suffix, as in example 1 below. However, the pronominal suffix may also be added directly to the verb, as in example 2 below. Both constructions have the exact same meaning. So let's look together at these two examples. The first one, Yishmor Othanu, he will keep us. Here you see the cal imperfect 3ms verb, followed by the definite direct object marker with a 1cp pronominal suffix, us. In the second example, Yishmerenu, it's also translated he will keep us. This is the cal imperfect 3ms verb again, but the pronominal suffix is attached directly to the verb. There are therefore two options in Hebrew for using pronouns as the object of a verb. The first with a definite direct object marker, and with the second attaching the pronoun directly to the verb. In this chapter, we're covering those instances where the pronominal suffix is attached directly to the verb. Before we move on, let's review type 1 pronominal suffixes that we'll see with the verbs. Look at your screen with me. These are the pronominal suffixes that you learned in chapter 9. Let's say them together just to review them. O, a, ka, ka, e, hem, hen, kem, ken, nu. Now you've probably memorized these with the lamed preposition, but that's okay. We're just reviewing the basic forms. These are the items that you're going to see suffixed to verbs. We'll begin by looking at pronominal suffixes that are attached to the cal perfect. The spelling of the cal perfect with pronominal suffixes appears on your screen now, and you can see that pronominal suffixes will appear on the cal perfect verb approximately 1,700 times in the Hebrew Bible. If you look on the right of your screen, you'll see two paradigms. In the left-hand column, you see the cal perfect strong verb paradigm that you've memorized from chapter 13. In the right-hand column, you see what those verbs look like before they take a pronominal suffix. I've highlighted all the changes in the vocalization or the spelling of the word before a pronominal suffix, and you can see some of them experience pretty significant changes. Let's work through some of these changes together. In the 3ms form, you'll see a vocal schwa under the kof and a kametz under the tet. In the 3fs form, you'll see the same vocalization pattern, vocal schwa under the kof, kametz under the tet, but you'll also see that the hey of the subformative has strengthened to tau in order to take the pronominal suffix. And you know that you cannot add anything to a Hebrew word that ends in a hey without that hey either dropping off or strengthening to a tau. And in this case, the subformative strengthens to a tau. In the 2ms form, we'll get propretonic reduction under the first syllable, and we'll lose the final vowel under the subformative before the pronominal suffix. The 2fs form is tricky because it now looks like the 1cs form. However, the 1cs form takes a pronominal suffix much more frequently than the 2fs. You will need to be aware, though, that the 2fs is an option. The other changes are fairly minor, except when we get down to the 2fp, where the 10 subformative becomes 2. That is, we lose the noon, and we end up with a shurik after the tau. Now, some of these changes seem fairly extreme, but over time you'll become comfortable seeing them. Remember, focus on what doesn't change and recognize those subformatives in the changing process. Here's an example of pronominal suffixes with the cal perfect 3ms, and you can see how it works when we translate it. In each instance, the pronominal suffix is translated as the object of the verb. Let's read through some of these. Katalo, he killed him. The pronominal suffix at the end of the verb is translated as the object of the verb. Katala, he killed her or it. Katalecha, he killed you. Katalech, he killed you again, but 2fs. And katalani, he killed me. Once again, in each instance, the pronominal suffix is being translated as the object of the verb. Let's now look at the spelling of the cal imperfect with pronominal suffixes. Now you can see from the number below that the imperfect appears with pronominal suffixes a bit more than the perfect. But the good news is that the imperfect experiences very little spelling change because the fact that they have a performative, and that performative at the beginning kind of protects the spelling structure of the verb. Just as we did with the perfect, we begin with our strong verb paradigm in the left, and you can see this is the paradigm that you memorized in chapter 15, so it's very familiar to you. Yiktol, tiktol, tiktol, tiktali, etc. In the column on the right, we have the verb before pronominal suffixes, and I've highlighted in red those changes that occur when a pronominal suffix is added to the imperfect verb. And you'll observe here that there are far fewer changes with the imperfect. In the 3ms, you get the reduction of the stem vowel. In the 3fs, in the 2ms, in the 1cs, and in the 1cp, you simply get the reduction of the stem vowel. In every other feature, the spelling of the imperfect is the same. So it's nice because the imperfect verb gets pronominal suffixes more, but the spelling changes are fewer. So it's easy to see what's going on here. Now, in addition to the type 1 pronominal suffixes that will appear with the perfect verb, imperfect verbs also appear with a separate set of pronominal suffixes, and these are called the noon suffixes. And there are really only 3 primary extra noon suffixes to learn. Let's look at what they are. There are 3 additional suffixes that occur on the imperfect. These additional suffixes are called the noon suffixes because of their distinctive forms with the consonant noon. So it's not a fancy name, but it certainly is descriptive. Let's look at those suffixes together. The first is the 3fs suffix, ena. The second is the 2ms suffix, eka. Now, we call the 2fs suffix a noon suffix because a noon is present. However, it's assimilated as a doggish forte in the kaf. You can see that this form looks fairly interesting. It's not a form that you see very often with a doggish forte in a final kaf, followed by a comets. But this is in fact the noon suffix. And then finally the 3ms form, enu. So we have ena, echa, enu. These are the 3 additional noon suffixes that must be memorized, and you can see each one of them appearing on the end of the verb in the examples on the right. Let's say those together. Yilkathena, yilkatheka, yilkathenu. It's also important to observe that the 3ms suffix here looks like a 1cp ending sufformative. Don't get those confused. Now let's look at the spelling of the cal imperative with pronominal suffixes. Look at your screens with me. Once again, on the left, we begin with those forms that appear without suffixes that you memorized as the paradigm in chapter 18. Kitol, kitli, kitlu, kitolna. Now, if you look on the right-hand column, you'll see how it's spelled before a pronominal suffix. First, observe that in the 2fs and the 2fp, we don't have forms listed there. That's because those forms do not appear with pronominal suffixes in the Hebrew Bible. With the 2mp form, there is no change in spelling. And then with the 2ms form, there is a change in spelling. Now we have a comma tatuf under the kof and a silent shawah under the tet before a pronominal suffix. You know that the imperative verb is derived from the imperfect. That is, you take the 4 forms of the second person imperfect, you chop off the preformative, and you have the imperative. So the imperative and the imperfect are related. It's also true with pronominal suffixes. The imperative and the imperfect take the same pronominal suffixes, meaning the imperative will also take a noon suffix. The noon suffixes on the imperative, therefore, are the same as those on the imperfect, including the noon suffixes. Let's look at some examples here. We begin with the imperative verb shamor. We're going to add our 3mp pronominal suffix, and we're going to get shomreim. Notice that in the spelling of the imperative verb with the pronominal suffix, the vocalization or vowel pattern is different. Under the shin, you have the comma tatuf, followed by the silent shawah under mem. You'll want to become comfortable or familiar with that spelling change with the imperative. In our second example, we get dir shu as the imperative 2mp. We're going to add the ni suffix and get dir shuni. In this instance, there are no spelling changes because the imperative 2mp does not undergo a spelling change with a pronominal suffix. And so it's fairly straightforward to see the imperative verb appearing on what you would know as the strong verb pattern. Parsing. When parsing verbs with pronominal suffixes, you will need to identify the verb and the person, gender, and number of the suffix. That is, you're going to have another category to become familiar with. This is similar to when you see a verb prefixed with the vowel consecutive, you must identify the vowel consecutive. Whenever you see a verb and you parse it, you want to make certain that you're giving all of the information that appears with that verb, not just the verb itself, but any prefixes or suffixes that appear with that verb in addition to the basic verbal structure itself. So when we see something like nathatikha, we want to parse that as the cal perfect 1cs from nathan, noon, tau, noon, with a 2ms pronominal suffix. Similarly, when we see a form like yilkadenu, we're going to parse that as the cal imperfect 3ms from lakad, lamed, kaf, dalet, with the 3ms pronominal suffix. So make sure that when you see a verb and you parse it, you're giving all the information, everything that appears with it. You are now looking at a summary of pronominal suffixes on the perfect, and you can see that there are a variety of forms appearing on the page. In the left-hand column, you're going to see the forms of pronominal suffixes after a consonant or prefix to a verb that terminates with a consonant. And in this right-hand column, you're going to see a summary of pronominal suffixes that are attached to verbs that terminate or end in a vowel sound. There's obviously a greater variety of pronominal suffixes that appear after a consonant because you're going to need different connecting vowels to connect the pronominal suffix to the verb. Now, what's important to observe in this summary chart are the similarities in forms. The similarities in forms. In the 3MS category, observe that there's always a wow or a hey in each form, both after the consonant or after the vowel. It does appear like there's a lot there, but there's more similarity than difference. In the 3FS category, there's always the form of a comets and a hey, either comets hey or hey comets. But again, the similarity should be enough to give you the proper identification. In the 2MS category, there's always the final cough with a comets inside that cough. In the 2FS category, a final cough with a schwa. In the 1CS category, a noon with hirik yod. In the 3MP category, mim. In the 3FP category, noon. The 2MP category are identical, chem. And in the 1CP category, always some form of nu. So don't be overwhelmed by those differences. Concentrate on the similarities. Let's look at a summary chart of pronominal suffixes on the imperfect. There are even more differences here. First, we see those forms that appear after a verb that ends with a consonant, and then those forms that appear after a verb that ends in a vowel. Again, there are similarities in each of the existing categories, but we have differences in pronouns too. In fact, pronouns in any language exhibit some of the greatest diversity in forms and spellings, and we have some of that in English too. You'll see the reason for the diversity in the English forms, you, thou, and y'all, is the same as the reason for the diversity in the Hebrew forms. Some of the diversity is accounted for by the region in which the terms were spoken. For example, y'all is a southern pronoun construction. Or some of the changes that we experience have to do with the history of the language. So for example, the English pronoun thou is an older pronoun. So we have kind of a diachronic reason and a dialectical reason for the diversity of forms here. It happens in every language. Again, it's important to concentrate on the similarities. Once again, in the 3MS category, we have either hu or enu. Those are the N suffixes. In the 3FS, we always have that comets hey or hey comets. In the 2MS, the final cough with the comets. In the 2FS, the final cough with a schwa. In the 1CS, all of the ni forms. And then we go all the way down to the 1CP with the new forms. Once again, it's important to observe the identical forms enu for the 3MS and enu for the 1CP. In such cases, context will have to be your guide in deciding whether that is a third masculine singular or first common plural pronoun. So before you move on, what should you do or know? First, carefully review the form and translation values for each of the pronominal suffixes, including the noon suffixes that you have encountered in this chapter. Second, carefully studying the spelling changes that occur with the perfect, imperfect, and imperative verbs when pronominal suffixes are attached. More attention will need to be given to the perfect because the spelling changes there are more dramatic than with the imperfect or the imperative. Finally, though individual pronominal suffixes appear in a variety of forms, make sure that you concentrate on those particular features shared by each form in order to facilitate identification. And so this concludes our lecture on Chapter 19, adding pronominal suffixes to perfect, imperfect, and imperative verbs.